Hey, 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 everybody. Happy Thursday. Welcome to Lawn and Garden Month on Echo Means Business. This month on Echo Means Business, we're doing a series of free webinars with leading brands and industry experts. For all session info, visit echomeansbusiness.com and go ahead, sign up. It's free. Create an account, come hang out with us. There's lots of good times like what we're about to do today. So, in this session, we're discussing advantages of design technology in implementing sustainable landscapes with my buddy Eric from Vectorworks. So let's get into it. Eric, introduce yourself, tell everybody what's going on. I hear you got a fun presentation for us.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. Eric Yolby. I'm a landscape architect and I'm the product marketing manager at Vectorworks. For the landscape industries, we actually sell to multiple industries, but I'm involved with the landscape, which is great because I'm a landscape architect and that's where I have practiced for all my time. So it's been a great opportunity, having been in practice, knowing what design tools can be doing for us as practitioners. But once I had a chance to learn about doing better workflows or finding ways to accommodate more responsible ways of designing and seeing more responsible ways of seeing landscapes installed and maintained, it's exciting to be able to share how technology can help with that.
No doubt, no doubt. As you can tell by the gray hair, I've done this for a couple years, and I've definitely seen how technology has gone from something that might help the industry to something that is the lifeblood of the industry, and it really allows us to compete at the level that we need to really be active and profitable in the industry. So I imagine Vectorworks is a great tool that is helpful for those in the industry. So tell us a little bit who's your typical client? When do people typically have the light bulb moment when Vectorworks is the right tool for them?
Sure. So landscape design, landscape designers, let's say landscape design build professionals, or even landscape architects, any of those people in the kind of general landscape design practice is going to find that Vectorworks Landmark will be their tool of choice because we do a lot more than what the industry standard might have been doing, or we do a lot more than what some of our competitors are doing, and it's more integrated. So you'll see examples of 2D and 3D merged workflows. You'll see smarter objects that are doing things like we're going to see some of the things today talking about terrain models being able to do analysis and stuff like that. So it allows us to make better decisions about our design that we're implementing, and we can test some of the things that we're doing before we even get in front of a client. So the benefit there is that all of those aspects that are making our workflows easier can also help us sell the project, especially if we're in a design build sense. We can sell the project a lot easier because we've tested it, we've been able to see what's working, what's not working, and we're not going to go to the client with something that's not working. So we definitely want to make sure that everything that we're doing is proofed before we get in front of them. And it's a great sales tool to be able to show them that you've tested it.
Yeah, I bet. I know one of the things that I've experienced is years ago, I actually went and got an associate's degree in landscape design. And a lot of the training that I received was creating more site plan, 2D view type designs. And in turn, those were great for me to view, or some architects that or developers that I worked with. They could look at it and read the plan, no problem. But what I discovered as I entered out into the real world was that not everybody could really understand those type of plans, and
Hmm.
they just see squiggles and circles and boxes, and you're trying to explain something, and they're still like, so the front of the house is here, or this is where the parking lot is, and I think you'll really, everyone, something that they can take away today is that what Vectorworks has to offer here is something that will really help eliminate that and give people kind of the oh my gosh, this is what my property can look like factor, because they can actually see it. They can wrap their mind around it. It's not just something that's kind of two-dimensional and on a big sheet of paper with a cost sheet attached to it, and they're having a little fear of like, I don't know if it's going to look good, and you want how much money? So with all that said, Eric, I'll let you take it away. This is going to be great.
Sounds great. Let me go ahead and share my screen. So bear with me for a moment. And we'll grab this up. All right, so we're through the title, through the introductions, and just so you know, Mike was mentioning his educational background. I also have an associate's degree in landscape contracting and construction, and I also have a bachelor's degree in landscape architecture. So all of this has kind of fed me towards this. But interestingly enough, all the time that I was in school, we were learning that this technology could have been out there for us, but we weren't necessarily using it in our class projects as much as we were doing hand drawing and physical models. So getting into technology from mid 90s on was certainly something that I think has been growing for a lot of people. There's still people out there doing hand drawings, still a lot of people moving from a general CAD application over to something smarter. So hopefully we'll be able to see some examples through this presentation that might spur someone to think about how they might use their own existing technology differently, or maybe make a move from one technology to another because these opportunities are out there. And I'll just also mention, we got some learning objectives we're going to get through here in a second, but this presentation has a wide cast of applications on what it could potentially mean to a lot of the practitioners in the office. So if you're working on lawn maintenance, you're going to see some things that apply to you, but not necessarily everything. If you're design build, same thing. If you're design, landscape design only, you're just going to see some portions in here that really relate directly to you, and other things that might be a little bit on the surface. My recommendation is that if you see something that isn't part of your process right now, maybe consider what it would be like to add that in, because the technology is there for you to be able to do so. But if it is something that is like, yeah, that's just not what we do, then no worries. We'll keep on going through the presentation, and hopefully we'll catch in all the options of things that do apply to your practice. So like what we're talking about here, the learning objectives, learning how to do GIS inside of your design workflow. This isn't something that we typically see a lot of practitioners doing, because GIS really means imagery mapping or something else that I might do for lawn takeoffs and things like that. Well, it's a lot more than that. So hopefully you'll see some examples of what that can turn into for us. Designing, knowing that you've got digital collaboration going on. So it used to be that we would collaborate in person on every single project. Now it's becoming more digital than ever. I mean, this presentation was kind of put together even before the pandemic, so there wasn't necessarily a lot of expectations that you would always be meeting with clients digitally. Well, now that has become, a little bit more normal, I guess, in the process of, some of the meetings might be digital and some of the meetings might be in person, but the collaboration certainly take place that way. And then using objects like plant objects and the smartness that are built into them to do custom reports. So one of the things that we've noticed right off the bat in moving to something that's landscape specific means that you have smart objects that tell their story, and you don't have to spend more time telling their story because they're doing it for you. And that's true with a lot of these other cases, and some of that could also translate into water efficiency or other kind of dynamics that are relative to sustainable sites. And then, other examples of this, informative polygons, digital terrain models. We just talked about plant data objects, but also the solar animation, doing custom reports, doing soil management with your software. Again, like I said, some of this stuff might seem like something you're not really all that in tune to do. It might be. You could just consider if there's an opportunity for you to add some of this to your workflows. And I do want to say that a lot of the content that you're going to see today was kind of pulled from what we see as objectives in LEED and sites. So if you're not familiar with LEED and sites, those are objective-based systems out there that typically are being used for a lot of commercial projects, sometimes residential projects, but definitely federal or government projects, to make sure that they are sustainable and energy efficient. And so we pulled a lot of those objectives into this presentation. So you're going to see some matchups there. So starting off, and when we see a screen like this, I'm going to ask Mike, if we have any questions so far. I'm going to assume that we don't yet. But once we get to the next screen that looks like this, I'm going to stop and see if we have any questions. So please feel free to type them into the chat box, and we will take some moments to see what's going on. This presentation could potentially last all of the time that's allotted to us, depending on how many questions we have going on. And that's not a bad thing. So just keep that in mind. So these are examples of some of the prerequisites and credits that are available through sites to be able to do some of this stuff. And so you're going to see some examples of different aspects of what could be potentially matched up with in an objective for your design process, and see whether or not this is worth the points, or in some cases are required. You can't get a sites project if you weren't doing some of these things to begin with. So those kind of things I think are interesting. All right. So beginning off with this is this idea that sometimes you might be a part of a project where a client is looking to do a project and they haven't even picked out their site yet. That isn't always the case. Sometimes we're dealing with a site that's already been purchased, already been secured. But if there's times when you can take a look at a site, or maybe even a portion of the site, and figure out what part of my site is best suited for the uses that I'm talking about here, one of the things that you can do within your design workflows is to integrate with GIS. So some examples that we'll see here, and a lot of this is going to be kind of visual. And if you see the notes on the sides, you can certainly take an opportunity to read them. I'm going to speak them anyways, but pay more attention, I think, to the graphics, because I think they're a little bit more telling about what your experiences will be like. But one of the things that you'll notice here is that you've got web services out there where you can go out and find data that kind of help you. So in this example of identifying prime farmland, if by chance you're in the process of trying to find sites and you want to make sure that your site is permissible to do a sustainable credit kind of project like sites, do not build on prime farmland. And in some cases, you can find out from the soils databases for the state that you work in what areas are considered prime farmland. But how do we get that soil data inside of your design workflow? Well, if you can find the GIS files from those sites like we just looked at, the Soil Data Mart is one, the USDA kind of directs you in where to find that. Once you find that kind of GIS information, you can import that into many applications. So here you happen to see our application, but you can also import it into AutoCAD, Civil 3D, some other kind of design applications where you can see that line work come in. And if you're working with something that's smart enough, you'll be able to see when you click on certain line work that it's giving you the data. So as here we see that this one happens to be Glenwood Silt Loam, which is has the initials of GWB. Well, that doesn't tell me if it's prime farmland yet, but GIS has actually expanded quite a bit since we've done this portion, where sometimes they actually have yes or no identified on prime farmland specifically for this reason. Right. But if you didn't have that benefit, you could come to your county, your state, and look to see what soils seem to be recognized as prime farmland soils. And this example you can see here was from Ohio. And we notice that that same initial base unit for soil is called this. And if we look in the prime farmland soil listings to see if this is included, we find out it actually is prime farmland soil. So we wouldn't be able to get credit if we tried to do our project on a site like this. So it's really kind of important to understand this. If you are trying to pursue those credits, that is something to be cognizant of. The other thing is, if you decide that you're trying to do this and you don't really care about the credits, find out why this is a requirement. Because if this is a requirement, you might just say, well, even though we're not trying to get sites or lead credit here, let's just try to stay away from soils that are being protected. And in some cases, some states might even have additional protections for that. So once you get that GIS file into your software, you can do some colorizations and things like that to make them more obvious. And so one of the things we'll see out of that is that very quickly we can see out of the whole collection of GIS files we brought in for the area we're looking at, there's a lot of prime farmland here. So we might want to take our project somewhere else, because if we decided we wanted to build along the Scioto River here just north of Columbus, there's a lot of prime farmland there. We're probably not going to get sites credit, and it's probably a bad idea for us to try to get in there and do this. Let's go find another place. And just to kind of give you a hint, Sites and Lead really enjoys the idea of taking existing developed sites and reusing them. So that's one of the main reasons why this is a thing, is like when you go into prime farmland, or what we call kind of green fields, where it has never been developed, or at least it hasn't had any development on it for centuries, then you're disturbing something that could potentially be a natural ecosystem for something else. But if you're already on a site that's been developed before and you're just rehabbing it to do something else, they love it, and they're going to give you more credits when that's the case. Another idea is floodplains. Now, if you're working on a project, and this is one of those examples where whether you're on a small scale site or a large scale site, it doesn't matter. GIS can help you understand if you're next to a waterway, if your project is going to be impacted by 100 or a 500-year flood. So here's an example of a project being done in DC, and literally every bit of line work that you see there was imported GIS line work. So it wasn't something that anybody else was out there creating for this specific project. This is all just imported in. And just so you know, the project that we're looking at is down here where it seems like it's open. Now, this was actually pre-developed, but it had been vacated. All of the things that were there had been removed. So it was ready to go for rehabbing and starting something else. But how much of that site would be impacted if it was going to be in a flood? So you'll see in this open space that we're considering, there is a portion here. This used to be a street, and that's probably why that grading allows some of that water surge to come up there if it were to do that. But the rest of the site might be okay. So if we had areas of our project that we knew were okay to be flooded, maybe we could put some of that down there. And then other parts of our project that would not be good at all if it was flooded, we might want to stick them closer to this area where it's not so impacted. And really, the idea of protecting the floodplains, it's protecting the site, but it's also protecting the floodplains too, because if the things that you're doing inside your project might pollute the site or pollute the waterway, that's certainly not advisable either. Protecting wetlands. So this is an example where I know for almost the whole time that I was practicing, that you always had to pay attention to if you had wetlands on your site. And if you did, and you were about to do something that would change that, you had to mitigate somewhere else. Well, not a lot of clients want to do that. So they might want to make sure that their site isn't showing those kind of indications for standing water for over 20 days or whatever those kind of scenarios are that tell you, avoid building or developing in sites where this is going on. GIS helps you there. You don't necessarily have to go and do a lot of digging. You can find information like this out from a lot of the natural resource um, GIS information to tell you. Okay, so these things can certainly be laid into your design process as well. Preserving threatened and endangered species habitats. So this is an example where GIS was brought in, but a lot of the documentation that you see in here was done by the landscape architect. So they were doing the documentation on top of what was already seen. A lot of the documentation he was doing was not already known knowledge. So he was adding to the GIS kind of realm of what was going on here, but he used GIS as his background. Okay, so from this perspective, being able to merge your processes here for your scope of work is important. Is this completely like landscape design? No, but this is a great example of how you can do other kind of things on your project that help build in expertise on sustainable sites, expertise on land use, things like that, so that you may be an expert that everyone comes to because you know a little bit more about all of that. So then there's this idea, if you're in an urban or more urban setting, how about we try to find ways to promote non-motorized transportation or using existing communities? And remember, we talked about brownfields and gray fields being already developed sites that need fixing. Those kind of things are certainly going to be there. GIS can help you identify them as well. But notice there's this little pink or purplish kind of path going through here that allows us to identify public transportation. So how close is our site to public transportation? We can get more credits if we try to promote that use of that public transportation over filling our site with parking and forcing everybody to kind of drive their way there. Okay. All right. Any questions so far, Mike?
Yeah, well, I got one. I remember back, like I mentioned, when I was a student many years ago, LEED certified was thrown around all the time. And I remember coming out of school, there was a developer that was doing some projects, and that was. They were looking for those credits as a possibility based on the site that they were developing on. And I was just thinking as I was listening, I'm going, I feel like I've heard that less over the past handful of years, but maybe that's just my location, or the group of clients that I'm working with now, and maybe their objectives and goals. And so I wanted to ask, like, was that something that was just a big fad and is kind of died down, or am I mistaken by saying that?
I don't think you're mistaken. I think the observation is clear and definite, but at the same time, I don't think that it's gone away like to the point where it's not relevant anymore.
Sure.
Um, One of the things that I would say is that there was a time when the federal government was implementing this on federal projects, and a lot of state governments were doing the same on state projects, but we weren't necessarily seeing a lot of commercial, or I should say, the smaller commercial and residential clients really seeking this because for them, it just this was a lot of expense. There's a lot of expense trying to get into sustainable practices. I mean, to know that you have a certain a portion of your land that's set aside that can't be used because it's buffering a waterway or something like that. Well, who's going to do that? Who wants to buy up all this land and pay all that money to have areas that they can't actually use for their own purpose? Well, the people who are trying to do the right thing, right? So that's the thing that I think that we would want to recognize is that not every client's going to ask for this. You can always recommend it. You can always be a firm that says we only do sustainable practices. So if you're trying to do something that's not sustainable, it doesn't agree with LEED or sites principles, it doesn't agree with other kind of known objectives, then we won't touch it. You could be one of those kind of firms, or you could decide, yeah, that doesn't matter to me either, and I don't care. But if people are kind of recognizing opportunities for being more of the advancing side of design and installation, to be kind of a front line kind of person in that idea of trying to help save the planet or trying to do things that kind of help combat climate change or anything else that kind of helps them develop a market where sustainability is being sought after, then this is important. That's one of the things that, even though lead and sites might have lost a lot of that impetus that they had at the very beginning when they were being introduced, they haven't gone away. Projects haven't necessarily dropped them. It's just the interest in, people knowing about lead and sites to be able to go pursue it has changed. And whether or not a client really wants to pursue credits is up for debate. It really depends on, you know, their scope of how they want to market their project or market themselves. I mean, I know of residences that have gone to the point where they have net zero exchange with electricity just because that homeowner really, it was very important to them. So who are they going to hire to work on those projects? The people who know how to do this, right?
100%. Yeah, that's kind of what I was taking away from listening to you. Is like, when it first came out, it was kind of like the hot button, like, oh, you got to be able to do this. And now, it's certainly a strength that you can play to. And
Yep.
I think that's how people are going to make money here in 2022 and beyond, is being able to play to their strengths and doing things that they know and do well. And there's certainly something to be said about being on the forefront of things, and they're trying to have a positive energy about what you're doing. So I dig that.
Sure.
That sounds real cool. So onward and upward. I'm excited to hear what's
Awesome.
next.
So this next part is really going to be about pre-design assessment, planning, kind of engaging other people, a little bit of this collaboration process. So what we'll notice here is that more and more everything's becoming more digital, more accessible because of its digital nature. So just like we were talking about, the access to GIS files is becoming easier and easier as we go along. To be able to come up with bubble diagrams and concepts and things like that, digital tools are becoming more advantageous. We see a lot of people doing things in one plan and then maybe they take it into Photoshop to pretty it up. Sometimes this is all possible in the application they're working in. So this ability to make use of digital technology to do different portions, doing the analysis, slope analysis, this is a larger project, of course, but, someone is paying attention to what the slopes are doing as they're planning their roadway or as they're planning, the vehicular use on a site. Let's try to avoid doing as much grading as possible because that costs more money. And, we can go along with the grades instead of fighting the grades. We can save money. And then, giving options, being able to show the client, options for where a project's going, being able to document for the purposes of a community review or a state, authorized review, being able to document. There's an example, water budgeting. We're going to get into that here shortly, but being able to know even from the beginning of the project that you have all of the professionals lined up to help with each of these phases, and eventually get to the point where you're doing layouts and construction documents. Um, this means that you're already thinking from the very beginning what the end goal is going to end up being and how technology can play that part. So if you can recognize that in your integrative design process, that at every step of the way that you have the ability to integrate what everybody else is doing, that's going to help with this sites or lead credit, that's going to be important. Now, like we said before, if by chance you're not pursuing lead or sites credits, being able to integrate with other people who are working on your project because of their expertise, this this doesn't go away. I mean, the idea is that you can still collaborate with these people. You know that you can trade PDF files with them. You know that you can exchange CAD files with them. You know that you can exchange a 3D model with them or whatever. Those kind of things will not go away just because you might not be doing leader sites. It's still a valid workflow to understand, but this is a requirement with lead and sites, is that they understand you can't be the expert of everything. Who all are you working with, and how are you going to integrate? So this is a process. We understand that, face-to-face meetings or getting together out on the site, um, doesn't necessarily happen every single time anymore. You might be out at the site once or twice, but as you're designing, you're going to do a lot of this from your office or from your home. Your communications with the people who you're collaborating with. Is it more digital than ever? Absolutely. Is it almost all digital? Probably. And there's apps out there for that. There's a lot of things that we're recognizing even today. Today's webinar is a new one that I've not been familiar with, but it's a great opportunity to understand the advantages of any technology that helps you get in front of your practitioners that you're collaborating with and with your clients. Okay, so in all of those cases, this ability to collaborate more digitally is just, it's not going to go away. You just have to figure out ways to continue to modernize and continue to adapt. So when you're doing your assessments, one of the things that we want to recognize is where technology can help you. So one of the things that you'll notice out of my slides is that if I call out something in red, there's going to be an area where design technology can help you. But in most cases, you're just going to see some examples kind of shown or written out. Here's an example of a slope analysis. So the few applications out there can actually figure out what your terrain surface looks like and how those slopes will be affected, or how they already are before you even start developing. The benefit here is that if you need to figure out what's mowable, what's not mowable, what is accessible, what's not accessible, what's going to erode, what seems to be safe from erosion, there's a whole bunch of reasons why you would want to know what slope analysis can do for you on your project. Being able to protect soil zones. There's going to be places where development just doesn't have to happen. So how would we do that? So here's an example where a new building's being constructed. They need a retention pond in there. How much land is going to be affected by this? Well, notice if they have a conversation with you as the contractor, or if you're a designer having a conversation with a contractor, everybody can kind of say, well, what's the maximum space needed to do this? And then use something as simple as the offset command in the use that you're going to do. So if it's a pond, how far away do we need to be? If it's a building, how far away do we need? That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to use all 40 feet if it's a building. It just means that, be prepared that there could be potentially 40 foot of zone around that structure that needs to be constructed. And that's going to affect some of your natural site, right? Engaging users and stakeholders, getting around together, giving them options to take a look at, websites that actually give you an opportunity to come in and comment. Those things are all continuing to be added to what you can potentially do with people, because again, You're not always going to be together like we see on the left. Sometimes being able to approach the people who have a stake in your project can be digital as well, and being done on websites and interfaces like that. All right. I know that I said I was going to ask for questions when we get through this, but I'm going to jump to this next section just so we can keep time, and then I'll ask to see if we have questions after that, if that's okay. So our first section on the site design side of things is water. Managing water, too much water, not enough water, all of those are kind of examples that we see varying throughout the US and in some cases around the world. But in most cases, what we're talking about here is US. So here on the East Coast, it's typically managing the water we're getting. On the West Coast, it's preserving the water we're getting because we need to be able to reuse it. And in some cases, that could be one and the same. So being able to reduce water consumption. So, I always jokingly use this, using the garden hose from your kitchen sink. If we all kind of thought about the irrigation and watering effort on our sites as using water from our kitchen sink to water, you might not necessarily hook up your hose as often as you need the water if you knew how many times you're pulling from this. Well, imagine the same principle is true. If you could kind of control how much water your landscape really needed, you might not have to go to potable water to water it all the time. And maybe there's ways of capturing water to be able to use it so you don't have to come in so many times to get your potable water. So this is an example of being conservative where water use is concerned. And one of the first things we like to go to is plants. How can we make sure that we're picking the right plant based on its water needs? And so there's a thing called a water requirement factor. So in a water budgeting process, there's what we call a water factor. It could also be a plant factor. The terminology is kind of similar depending on what you're looking at, but just realize that sometimes it's not about plants. You can have a water factor applied to something like a fountain or a pool or something like that that has to be refilled on occasion. So it actually definitely has a need for water. It can't just stay the way it is. Um, but in some cases, your CAD application might have plant data associated to it. And how much plant data can it tell you? Can it tell you the species? Can it tell you its performance? Can it tell you whether it's low water needs, high water needs? Can it tell you, what kind of soil it needs? Well, this example, if you have enough information built into your plant data that can help you understand whether you're picking the low water needs plants versus high water need plants, that kind of helps you from the get-go. Right. So again, if you're not pursuing sites, not a big deal. You could still try to do the right thing by always trying to pick plants that don't necessarily need to be watered every single week with an inch of water every single week. Maybe you have some that are drought tolerant, some that are low water use and whatnot to try to make things a little bit easier on the water use. Because one of the things that our design technology can do for us is to take all of those requirements that are out there. So if you're doing sites or lead, or if you're doing something in California where the MWELO is concerned, maybe you're in Texas where there's a municipal requirement for water efficiency, there's going to be these factors out there. There's going to be calculations that understand, well, what do you think that this landscape is going to require? And then what do you think that this site will allow you to do based on the size of the site and based on the water allowance that municipality is allowing you? And how can you make that easier by using non-potable water? And how do you get non-potable water? So this is all really kind of where we see an alphabet soup of calculations going on. And this can be helped by worksheets. So being able to use worksheets to help tabulate a lot of this area, calculating area of your watering needs, which we call hydrozones, tabulating the numbers of the watering requirements for each of the zones is going to be essential there, how much area is taken up. And this starts to build up this idea of what this hydrozone plan could be accommodating for your project. And then once you've done that, that same worksheet um, can then pull more information. Like here's an example of what type of watering is being used. Drip irrigation. Well, we know that drip irrigation is more efficient than spraying overhead, but in some cases you might not be able to use drip irrigation in an application, or it's not economical to use in some applications. So, how effective can we make this based on the things that we're doing? So that worksheet that you're talking about that kind of tabulates all of those hydrozones can be used in what's called a water budget. And this is an example of an EPA WaterSense water budget. So if you're ever interested in knowing more about the EPA WaterSense water budget, You can always do a Google on this, but essentially it's an EPA thing, and that's the basis for leading sites for water efficiency. California has another one called MWELO, and I'm sure that other organizations or other municipalities do something similar. Here's an example where a landscape architect out of Alabama was doing their own calculations using their worksheets inside their design program to be able to understand what they were doing and what their goals were, and seeing whether or not they met the percentage of their allowance to be able to meet and get credits. So even though something might be allowed, sometimes you get more credits if you are like 75% of that allowance, or maybe even 50% gets you more points. So they're looking for ways to not only just be inside the allowance, that they're looking for ways to do better than what's in the allowance. We talked a little about this idea of getting non-potable water. Where does that come from? Well, a prime opportunity is to collect it from the rooftops, because it moves pretty quickly on rooftops. How quickly can we get that water from the rooftop into something to store it? Well, how much water is going to come off of that rooftop to be stored, and then how we size our water storage capacities to be able to do this. Again, your design program understands area, it understands slopes, it understands this idea of being able to project how much square footage and how much that's going to translate into calculating volume of water storage. So here's another example where they did something like this, where they had precipitation on site and what its expectation was, how much was going to be collected. So then they use the potable, non-potable water that you wouldn't necessarily be drinking from, that's been collected, and how does that offset what irrigation is required, so that your required irrigation can be in a percentage to get you more points. The other thing that we recognize out of this workflow is that terrain models, what we call a digital terrain model, it's a 2D and 3D representation of your grades, your surfaces, and they can be smart enough to tell you which way water's moving, right? So if you know which way water is going to move once it hits the ground, that can help you figure out where you're going to put water retention to be able to hold some of that water on site. Okay, so how do you get to a DTM? A DTM can be made from using 3D polygons. You can get 2D polygons and convert them to 3D polygons. You can go out to a site and take survey and get elevation points. Doesn't matter what your method of capturing site data is, as long as you can get your location and your elevation point, that can be converted to a surface inside of your design solution if you're using something like Vectorworks or Civil 3D, some of these other applications that give you the ability to chart 3D things inside the software. Okay, so that line work of those points can turn into a terrain model that has a 2D contour representation. You can start to identify where you might want to do water retention, and then figure out if it was retaining, how much grade needs to be moved to do that. And then visually, you get an example of seeing how this might look with that retention in place. Right. Going into this idea of restoring aquatic ecosystems. So a little bit different than what we were just talking about, but it's still kind of related to quality of water, is being able to help protect some of these water systems. So if you notice in this case, this project happens to be along the river corridor, and sites would require them to put a buffer in there to keep the runoff as filtered as possible before it gets into the river. So you have other mechanisms too, but this buffer is another requirement. So what can you use to kind of document this? Well, there's a thing called a landscape area tool inside our software, but maybe you have other kind of applications where it talks about mixed use plantings and things like that, and you can get the area takeoff from there. You can figure out how much of the plants you need to be able to specify for your project, and those kind of things that can be quantified inside your software or inside your worksheets. Okay. Landscape areas can be used to do this. You can see this example here where a lot of these plant data or plant objects are being recognized here. How far apart are they being spaced for each other, and what that percentage of overall coverage might be in this landscape area. The object itself just looks like a shape with a fill on it. But the information that's built into it is telling you exactly what it's built up to do because of how the tool is built. Okay, so it's not only giving you surface area calculations, it's telling you what plants are in there, and it tells you how much of the plants you need, and it helps you to document for these kind of sustainable processes. All right, real quick, any questions so far, Mike?
Oh, just one takeaway that I'm having listening to this is it's a great reminder that the people that really do well for themselves in this industry are the ones that really can educate the people that they're working for. And rather than having someone come to them and say, "I need this, you do this for me," what a lot of times those people really need, and very rarely do they come and say something like that. They need us to educate them, to tell them what the right plant is, and to make sure that we're designing an irrigation system that doesn't overwater everything, which is all too common where I am in Southeast Michigan. Somehow people, especially if they have money, think that more water is just automatically better all the time, even though I'm the one that's okay. We can turn up the zones there, and then I just turn the water off at the backflow preventer so the system doesn't run for a little bit, because it's very wasteful. It's very wasteful, and it's good to kind of be able to do what you can do to help be a steward of the environment. So I'm loving this presentation. I can't wait to hear what's next.
Awesome. So next we have this discussion of soil and vegetation. And in some cases, these site design sections had been separated. And so I've put some of them together just to kind of help expedite some of this, because some of the tool usage are very similar. You're going to see that landscape area tool talked a few more times in here, but just you'll see some examples where this kind of comes into play. Again, landscape area is helping out figuring out your soil protection zone. So here's a proposed retention basin. How much area around that basin when it's getting built is going to be affected? What do we need to do with this area around the pond that's being built to bring it back to what it kind of was before it got trampled on and compacted and all those kind of things? Obviously, this isn't the only space. It would be the access to get here too. But how do we remediate this? This is what we refer to as soil protection zones, right? So you can use landscape areas to calculate how much of that is going on. We talked a little bit about this idea of erosion and the slope analysis. Here's an example where we can see some red areas on this project where if these aren't fixed, there's definitely going to be erosion going on, and probably in the direction towards this waterway, right? So we want to make sure that those kind of things are remediated so that they're not going to be an issue. And again, slope analysis allows us to do that. Being able to understand this offset, we talked a little bit about this before with the soil management plan, so we'll keep on moving. But notice that in this case where that offset is going on, or that geometry offset can be identified very simply in these object tools. But at the same time, you can see a little bit of a line that shows up. Well, if this were truly 40 feet away from the building, this is how much of that vegetation area is going to get trashed, right? Do we really have to go that far away from this structure to make that happen? And if we find out that maybe this structure could go somewhere else on the site with this kind of a footprint, then we know that maybe we have better success without trashing a lot of the existing vegetation and the existing natural systems. Right. So these kind of things I think are helpful for us as we develop our plans for how the site's going to get used. And it also is a great time to have that conversation between designer and contractor to say, yeah, I don't need 40 feet to be able to build this thing. So we can even put a fence up to kind of keep it closer to 20 or 25 feet. Those kind of things I think are helpful to be able to identify that. Being able to use the right plant is what we were talking about before. Well, this isn't a big surprise to understand that controlling or managing invasive plants is an important part of sustainable site processes, right? So introducing plants that we used to and still can find in the nursery that are identified as invasive plants, this is something that kind of challenges us in the industry these days. But then there's going to be plants like stilt grass that nobody likes. There's nobody who can appreciate the plant like that because it chokes out everything. I mean, there's going to be this give and take about plant material that will just find its way to spread crazy like. And we want to be able to come up with plans on how we can control them. So you can learn about competitive or invasive plants from the USDA. The NRCS has some good information about invasive plants that we would want to pay attention to, what's considered invasive in certain areas, what might be invasive in one part of the state might not be invasive on another part of the state. So it just depends on that climate and the soil character, humidity, things like that, wind flow, all those kind of things can play a difference in how invasive something can be. So sometimes you have to pay attention to what part of the states are what. Here's an example in Virginia. So if we look at the mountain, Piedmont, and coastal regions, we might see that some of these plants are invasive everywhere, and some of them are not. Maybe in the coastal area it's invasive, but the other areas it's not. Those are things to kind of pay attention to when you're thinking about what you add to your list, what you take off your list. Those kind of things I think are helpful for us. And where does this information go? It goes into your database. So you'll see an example here where our software has a plant database that you can add some of this invasive information to. How do you control something if you found it on site? Because you don't necessarily need it to take over the landscape that you're so dutifully trying to install. So those kind of things you can show what those control methods would need to be. So a good example for landscape management companies. Being able to calculate biomass. So this means like if you're taking away existing vegetation, are you returning enough vegetation to that site to be able to compensate for what you took away? Maybe it's just the idea of maybe you didn't have vegetation on site that was worth anything. So we're adding biomass to the site. So being able to do the calculations and calculating the plant spread into an area and then allowing that to become calculatable in a worksheet certainly can benefit you in calculating for biomass. And then native plants, being able to promote the use of native plants. Now, there's going to be some concessions here. I think in some cases, natives, true natives, or strict natives of what they're talking about versus other plants that are native like or native ours. Those can kind of be some discussion points for where you are doing your project and what seems to be permissible. What does the client want? What does the municipality require? Those kind of things I think are important to recognize. But where can you find out about that? Same place. USDA has a great resource for understanding what plants are native in those areas, just like they do for invasive plants. Okay. Another example that I always like to pull on is getting resources from the plant providers. Proven winners can talk to you through their website about the plants that are more native on the scheme of things and what you can specify that are recognized as native plants in every region that you're looking at. So don't be afraid to look at some of these plant provider websites as well, because they can give you the information that you need about the plants that you really want to get from them, right? Or maybe the customer is asking for plants from them because they really have seen them in garden centers, or they've seen them installed somewhere else, or they just read about them and they really want to make use of them. So landscaping with native plants means the same thing. Grab that information from the information sources that you can get, put that information in your database, and make use of it from then on. So you can make use of, here's an example of Baptisia or false indigo, and some of the information about its native, um, what does it succeed in its native area of growing, and making sure that all of those elements that are involved are put into your database, so that when you're picking plants that have certain soil requirements or certain exposure requirements or hardiness zones or climate zones or something like that, that even if that plant wasn't already there on site, you might know that it typically would do well on that site because of its native behavior. Conserving and using native plants. So whenever you find native plants that are worth keeping, you definitely want to do whatever you can to preserve them. Every once in a while, you're going to do kind of a site survey to see what's on there, and you'll see a portion that is not quite so native. What are we going to do about this 10%? Is it already in controlled situation? If not, what do we need to do to control it so that the rest of the native plant communities continue doing their thing? In my backyard, I should say in the far back side of my yard, I'm in a wooded area, and wisteria has just taken over on some of those trees. So I would go through there on a regular basis and prune them back so that they die, and I don't need wisteria choking out my existing native trees. Those kind of things are things that we might consider in our maintenance plan as well. Being able to use plants for energy efficiency is always been there. In fact, for as long as I've been in the industry, we talked about using plants to break the wind. using plants for shade. Those kind of things that allow us to make the site area that we're using, or even the building that's in that site, more energy efficient by being able to do this. We get this information, and we can use a spacing tool. For example, within the plant tool, you can say, well, if it says that these shade trees need to be no further apart than 24 feet, then let's set the spacing to 24 feet or less, and make sure that we are abiding by that requirement. And then use the labeling tool to tell everybody, hey, look, we're at that required spacing, so there's no question here that we're meeting that requirement. And then obviously recognizing where sun and shade could be placed. So here's an example of a solar animation, being able to document or visually see where sun and shade is going from the elements that you've created. So is it comfortable? Is it energy efficient? Is it reflecting the sun instead of absorbing the sun? Yeah, energies, those kind of things I think are helpful to be able to see in these visualization tools. And those tools can be identified, that Heliodon or the solar animation that we see can identify, its time, its place on the earth, and, seeing the example of what happens at 9 o'clock, 12 o'clock, and 3 o'clock, you can see the differences change here. And if you notice that there's some areas that are really just in sun all day long, maybe there's something else we can do to kind of fix that, and then add more plant material closer up and see the change there from 12 o'clock or 9 o'clock, 12 o'clock, and 3 o'clock, and see, oh, now we're starting to see some shade effectively on the building. Maybe not as much as we'd like. Maybe we could keep adding some things to it, but ultimately this helps us test our ideas to see if we are getting to that more energy efficient process there. Being able to document how much space is reflective and what's not reflective. Not reflective means it's just going to get hotter. Reflective means it's going to be cooler. So if we can find how much square footage on our site is made out of highly reflective material and how much is made out of non-reflective material, we can calculate and document how much of this heat island effect we are either fixing or adding to. And obviously, to be able to get those credits, we need to do the taking away of the heat island effect. And we're not too far from done, so I just want to ask real quick again, Mike, any questions before we're almost done from wrapping up?
Man, I love those animations. Those type of tools right there have caused light bulb moments for clients of mine who go, "That's what it's going to look like," and the sales process is pretty easy from there on out. It really is a great differentiator. So I'll let you wrap up here, but that was something I was really hoping you were going to show, because I think that that's a big game changer.
Absolutely. So in these last sections, we're talking about material selection, and some of this kind of goes without saying about the idea of reusing what's already on the site. How do you calculate it? We'll pull that GIS aerial in and trace it out and figure out how much is already there. How much of that is likely to stay, or if it's not going to stay where it's at, can we reuse it somewhere else on the site? So being able to calculate those kind of materials from that method is definitely there by just plain tracing and getting that area calculation. Being able to document when you're reusing something. So maybe a school was closing down and they had a whole bunch of site furniture that needed to be relocated instead of just sent to the landfill. So we hear about these things and we run out there and grab a bunch of this stuff and reuse it on the site. Might need to get cleaned up and repainted or refinished or something, but maybe we have this ability to reflect that we've got certain amount of reused material on site. Okay. Human health and well-being, another example of being able to prove that your site is safe, that it's comfortable, that people can be restorative when on this site. So you see examples here, light pollution, things like that. So how does design solutions help us out with that? Well, GIS again can help you with making sure that you know how close you are to cultural resources and that they need to be protected, right? So those kind of things are there. Being able to understand if your site is accessible. So having a tool like a grade tool that allows you to identify, from one elevation to another, are we in an accessible space? Can I get a 8% slope that is the max slope for an ADA accessible ramp? Is that possible in this space? Have I created an accessible ramp, or is it too steep? Those kind of things I think are helpful. being able to recognize clear views into and out of our site. So we use the same image for what we were talking about for solar, but notice if I had created a landscape area back here and I surrounded it by tall fences and hedges and I couldn't see into this, and I'm a customer thinking, well, now I feel kind of weird because it looks like I don't know what I'm coming into. I can't see into the site. Maybe I don't feel safe. So being able to help the customer understand how safe they can feel in accessing and being in the site is something that you can visualize with 3D modeling as well. Doing animated walkthroughs. Here's a quick example, being able to show, being able to take a client from inside their house and seeing the things that are going outside of their house. But does this seem like something you can see very easily in your landscape? I apologize for the graininess. I think probably when this is re-aired, you'll see some graininess on this because it's a video being played on a recorded video. But ultimately, this idea of a walkthrough. Walkthroughs are becoming more popular now. This happens to have been done a few years ago, but walkthroughs now in other programs like Lumion or Twinmotion can be almost surreal. You can see birds flying and grass flowing and whatnot. So it really kind of gives you this very surreal experience of being in this site. But here's an example where you can kind of show the customer how you are making them feel comfortable on site and their well-being would be supported. And we're almost done. Lighting pollution, being able to make sure through photometric studies or even visualized renderings with lighting to make sure that your site is adequately lit and you're not lighting the neighbor's property too. You know, we hear about some communities with dark sky movements. Is your light shining up into the sky, or is it only downward? Is it being shielded from other uses, or is it just glaring for everybody? Those kind of things can be resolved. And then even the idea of preferential parking is one that I love seeing this image from our landscape architect in Alabama who made use of the parking tools inside the software to be able to show that they have enough handicap spaces, but also some spaces for recharging vehicles and things like that. Just being able to have them tell their story, those smart objects being reported. And that's it. I knew that we had to kind of pull this together in an hour. We got there, but I'm ready to take questions. Just a little bit of a page saying thanks to everybody who contributed to this presentation. And then other than that, I'm ready to take questions if we have more.
Well, I guess just the last question I have as we wrap this up here is you've been in the industry a little while. What's one piece of advice that you'd give to our community to just make them more successful this year?
Yeah, so when we talk about the idea of making our outdoors livable, there's things that we want to try to do that help support the user and their site and making sure that they are comfortable, they do feel comfortable in their site, they feel restorative because they spent the last 2 years having to stay home. So a lot more people are expecting their outdoor space to be better than it was 2 years ago. This is not going to go away. A lot of people are now working from home. A lot of people are doing more at-home activities because of what's happened. So the outdoors and the improvement of the outdoors is not going to go away. The comment that I would say, because of the sustainable side of how we want to approach this, is there's better ways of being able to promote what you're going to do to a site to make sure that not only can they enjoy it, but it actually supports the ecosystem around them. It actually controls water better instead of making things erodible. Your neighbors aren't going to be offended by the things you're doing. All those kind of things that are kind of integral with this idea of best management practices for site installation, site management, and actually, the ability to use the site in a very sustainable way. So I think all those things are going to be increasingly important the more that people are staying home, or if we're looking at commercial projects where people are going somewhere for a respite and they expect to kind of be in a nice restorative outdoor environment for them.
Great. Wow, what a great answer. Well, I see some of the feedback here. Everyone's really enjoyed this. So Eric, thank you so much for joining us here. And to all of you following along here, make sure you give Echo Means Business a follow over on Instagram and social media, Facebook or Meta or whatever we're supposed to call them now. And of course, head on over to echomeansbusiness.com, where you'll get to see not only more fun conversations that we'll be having over Lawn and Garden Month here, but just a whole other host of resources and camaraderie, and getting to hang out with your fellow contractors and then great vendors like our buddy Eric here from Vectorworks. So thank you so much to all of you for joining us, and we will see you on the next one. Take care.
Awesome.
Be safe, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.